December 18th, 1942. A refrigerated meat store beneath Smithfield Market, London. The air is thick with the smell of sawdust and frozen fat, and a young Austrian scientist named Max Perutz is standing over a block of ice that should not exist. He has spent the last 3 weeks in this freezing basement, watched over by security guards who believe him to be developing a new type of ration packaging. He is not. He is testing whether a mixture of frozen water and wood pulp can be strong enough to build a battleship. Above him, in Whitehall, men in pinstripe suits are debating whether the Allies can win the Battle of the Atlantic without it. Below him, in the cold and the dark, Perutz raises a hammer and brings it down on the block. It does not shatter. It barely marks. Somewhere in that quiet basement, an idea that sounds like madness has just become something closer to engineering. This is the story of Project Habakkuk, the British plan to build an aircraft carrier out of reinforced ice, a vessel intended to be longer than 4 football pitches, nearly unsinkable by torpedo, and cheap enough to be built from little more than frozen water and sawdust. It sounds like the plot of a wartime farce. It was, for a period of roughly 18 months, one of the most seriously funded engineering projects in Britain. To understand why anyone believed a ship made of ice could win a war, you first have to understand just how desperate that war had become. By the winter of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the single greatest threat to Britain's survival. German U-boats operating in coordinated wolfpacks were sinking Allied merchant shipping faster than British and American shipyards could replace it. In November 1942 alone, more than 700,000 tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom of the ocean. Convoys carrying food, fuel, and munitions from North America to Britain had to cross a stretch of the mid-Atlantic that lay beyond the range of any land-based aircraft. A stretch the Admiralty grimly nicknamed the Air Gap, or the Black Pit. Inside that gap, convoys sailed without air cover, and U-boats knew it. They waited there, and they killed there, and Britain's ability to keep fighting depended on somehow closing that gap. The obvious solution was more aircraft carriers, vessels that could sail with the convoys and provide air cover across the entire ocean. But conventional carriers required enormous quantities of steel, a material Britain simply did not have to spare. Every ton of steel was already earmarked for tanks, for merchant ships to replace those being sunk, for the bombers of the combined bomber offensive. Shipyards were operating at capacity and still could not keep pace with losses. Building enough conventional carriers to close the air gap was, by most estimates, simply not possible within the time frame the war demanded. Britain needed floating air bases, and it needed them built from something other than steel. Into this crisis stepped Geoffrey Pyke, a journalist, inventor, and self-taught polymath who had escaped from a German internment camp during the First World War and spent the intervening decades generating a stream of unconventional ideas, some brilliant, many bizarre. Pyke worked for Combined Operations Headquarters under Lord Louis Mountbatten, a division of the British war effort deliberately designed to entertain unconventional thinking. It was here, reportedly while researching methods of building airstrips on Arctic ice for a separate scheme, that Pyke encountered the work of an American inventor who had experimented decades earlier with reinforcing ice using wood pulp. Pyke recognized the potential immediately. Ice, on its own, is a poor structural material. It is brittle, it cracks under stress, and a ship's hull built from pure ice would shatter under the strain of ocean swell within hours. But ice reinforced with wood fiber behaves entirely differently. The material became known as Pykrete, named with a certain immodesty after Pyke himself. The formula was almost absurdly simple: roughly 14% wood pulp mixed with 86% water, then frozen. The wood fibers acted as a kind of natural reinforcement, similar to the steel rods inside reinforced concrete, distributing stress through the material and preventing the catastrophic cracking that plagues ordinary ice. Testing, much of it carried out by Pykrete in that refrigerated basement beneath Smithfield Market, revealed that Pykrete was remarkably strong. It could withstand impacts that would shatter pure ice instantly. It melted far more slowly than ordinary ice, since the wood pulp insulated the core. And crucially, it required no steel at all, only water, wood pulp, and a functioning refrigeration system to keep it frozen through an Atlantic summer. The demonstration that sealed the project's fate has become one of the more celebrated anecdotes of the Second World War, though the precise details vary between accounts. At a conference in Quebec in August 1943, attended by Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and their assembled military staffs, Lord Mountbatten is said to have brought 2 blocks into the meeting room, one of ordinary ice and one of Pykrete. He fired a pistol at the ordinary ice, which shattered as expected. He then fired at the Pykrete, and the bullet reportedly ricocheted off the surface, and according to some tellings, narrowly missed one of the assembled admirals. Whatever the precise truth of the story, the message landed. Churchill, who had already taken a personal interest in the scheme after receiving a memo on the subject, gave it his enthusiastic backing. The plan that emerged was staggering in scale. The proposed vessel, designated HMS Habakkuk, after a verse from the Old Testament prophet, whose name means, with a certain grim irony, embrace or wrestling, was to be roughly 600 meters, 2,000 feet long, with a displacement estimated at around 2.2 million tons, dwarfing any warship then in existence by a factor of many times. Its hull walls were to be more than 12 meters, 40 feet, thick at points, riddled with a network of refrigeration pipes to keep the structure frozen solid even in warmer waters. Inside this vast iceberg of a ship, engineers envisioned hangar decks capable of housing over 150 aircraft, workshops, crew quarters for more than 1,000 men, and a self-contained power plant to run the refrigeration units that would, quite literally, keep the entire vessel from melting into the sea. Proponents argued the ship would be almost impossible to sink by conventional means. A torpedo strike that would tear open a steel hull would, they believed, simply punch a hole that could be patched with a slurry of more Pykrete, refrozen within hours. A prototype was built in early 1943 at Patricia Lake, in Jasper National Park, in the Canadian Rockies, chosen for its remoteness and its reliably cold climate. Laborers, many of them conscientious objectors assigned to alternative war service, constructed a scaled-down vessel, roughly 18 meters, 60 feet, long and 9 meters, 30 feet, wide, insulated with wood shavings and cooled by a small refrigeration unit housed on board. Through the summer of 1943, the prototype sat on the lake, refusing to melt even as the surrounding water warmed. It was, by the narrow standard of proving the material could survive a Canadian summer, a genuine success. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. And there is plenty more of Britain's strangest wartime ingenuity Still to come. Set against Germany's own wartime engineering, Project Habakkuk occupied a strange category almost entirely its own. The Kriegsmarine pursued no equivalent program. German naval strategy in this period focused on refining the U-boats that had made the air gaps so lethal in the first place, alongside advanced submarine designs such as the Type 21, rather than exotic surface vessels. The comparison that mattered more was with conventional Allied solutions to the same problem. Escort carriers, smaller and cheaper than fleet carriers, were being built in growing numbers in American shipyards throughout 1943, and long-range aircraft, such as the American B-24 Liberator, fitted with extended fuel tanks, were gradually extending the reach of land-based air cover further and further into the Atlantic. Neither of these alternatives promised anything close to the theoretical invulnerability of a Pykrete carrier, but both were achievable using industrial processes, shipyards, and aircraft factories already understood. Habakkuk, by contrast, demanded new construction techniques, new refrigeration infrastructure, and new logistics for an untested material, all under wartime pressure, for a single vessel that would take an estimated 8 months or more to build even once construction began in earnest. By late 1943, the calculus that had made Habakkuk attractive was quietly falling apart. The introduction of longer-range aircraft, and separately, the deployment of escort carriers and improved radar and sonar technology across existing convoy escorts had begun to close the air gap through more conventional means. The Battle of the Atlantic, while far from over, had turned decisively in the Allies' favor during the spring and summer of 1943, a shift often dated to the events of May 1943, sometimes called Black May by U-boat crews, when Allied escorts and aircraft sank an unprecedented number of German submarines. The urgent operational need that had justified Habakkuk's extraordinary cost and complexity was simply evaporating. Estimates for a full-scale vessel suggested a cost rivaling several conventional carriers, along with enormous quantities of timber pulp diverted from other wartime uses, and a refrigeration plant larger than anything previously constructed. Faced with a shrinking need and a growing bill, the Allied planning staff quietly shelved the project before a full-scale hull was ever laid down. The legacy of Project Habakkuk is a curious one because its impact was almost entirely intellectual rather than material. No Pykrete carrier ever sailed into battle. No U-boat commander ever had to reckon with an iceberg firing aircraft at his position. And the psychological effect the design might have had on the German Navy remains necessarily entirely speculative. What Habakkuk did produce was knowledge. The engineering work carried out on Pykrete's structural properties fed directly into later research on composite and reinforced materials, and Max Perutz went on to a rather more celebrated career, winning the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962 for his work on the structure of hemoglobin, work he always maintained had been sharpened by the discipline of those freezing weeks beneath Smithfield Market. The Patricia Lake prototype, once construction was abandoned, was deliberately allowed to sink to the bottom of the lake in 1943, where its timber frame and refrigeration machinery remain today, a popular and slightly eerie destination for recreational divers exploring the cold, clear water of the Canadian Rockies. It is tempting, looking back, to treat Project Habakkuk purely as a wartime curiosity, a footnote filed somewhere between the earnest and the eccentric. That would be a mistake. The project emerged from a genuine and desperate calculation that Britain's survival depended on solving a problem that conventional industry could not solve fast enough, using conventional materials that simply didn't exist in sufficient quantity. Geoffrey Pike's answer was strange, and it required scientists to test bullet impacts on ice in a meat locker, and laborers to build a miniature battleship on a remote Canadian lake. But it was never irrational. It was ingenuity operating at the outer edge of wartime necessity, chasing an answer through whatever material happened to be at hand, even if that material was frozen water and sawdust. Return, for a moment, to that basement beneath Smithfield Market, to the hammer coming down and the ice refusing to break. That single moment captures something essential about the entire war effort, of which it was a small and unlikely part. An underlying willingness to test the impossible, because the alternative was worse. Project Habakkuk was never built. The air gap closed by other means, through faster aircraft and better radar, and a navy that slowly won the upper hand against the U-boats, without any help from an iceberg armed with fighter planes. But for 18 months, some of Britain's sharpest scientific minds worked in genuine seriousness on the question of whether the country could freeze its way to victory. They never got the chance to find out whether it would have worked at full scale. What they proved in that cold basement and on that remote Canadian lake was that it might have. Sometimes the strangest ideas are not signs of desperation giving way to madness. They are signs of desperation refusing to give up. A battleship of ice never sailed. The willingness to build one very nearly changed the war.